The Saptamsha, or the sevenths of a sign. It's the subdivision that focuses in on interpreting your creativity and your fertility. So this chart talks a lot about our artistic talent, how creative we are. Creativity also reveals your inventiveness, like how creative are you towards solving problems? How quickly do you come up with new ideas that are useful? Creativity also has to do with your skill as a carpenter, believe it or not. Maybe not as like somebody who's told what to build, but as somebody who figures out how to build things. So this chart reveals a lot about how well you come up with designs and how cleanly you put things together to make finished products. Another ramification of creativity is your ability to manifest things. So this chart is really talking about not just your creative ideas, but your ability to make something real out of your creative ideas. Or if you have a problem in that regard, it will also show up in this chart. The chart also has to do with your fertility, in other words, procreation. So it has a lot to do with describing our sexuality, our libido. Not only that, but it also describes the products, so the children. And not only children, but kind of everything that you leave behind. What do you actually manifest in this life out of your ideas that becomes something significant that stays in the world after you're not here anymore? So this is really a fascinating subchart. And in this video, I'm going to show you how to construct it and to start to do the most basic and important interpretations of it. If you want to know what this means to you and your chart, I have just released a brand new and very groundbreaking report that explores exactly that, all of the subdivisions for your chart. It's available now on my site, victicare.com. The Saptamsha literally means the sevenths of a sign. So it's one of the zodiacal subdivisions of the zodiac. It's one of the zodiacs within the zodiac. You can see it on this wheel along with the other zodiacal subdivisions. If we zoom in on it, I can show you how it is put together. It's based on dividing one sign into 7 equal parts. And then each part is identified with another zodiac sign. In a simple order, you just start at the beginning of Aries and then ascribe that as Aries and go in order from that. When you get to the end of a sign, you don't worry about that, you just keep going. And when you get to the end of the zodiac, you don't worry about that either, you just keep going, you restart. That gives you this complete wheel of 84 unique subdivisions. Now, since this chart is about human sexuality, there's something really interesting being said about the pattern that forms here. I'll describe it for you now, and I'd like you to think about what it means and maybe share your thoughts in the comments. So the interesting thing about the pattern that's formed in the Saptamsha is that every male sign begins with itself, begins with the first sign from it. It begins with its own sign. So for example, Aries begins with Aries, Gemini begins with Gemini, Leo begins with Leo, and so on. But on the other hand, every female sign begins with its own 7th. So Taurus, for example, begins with Scorpio. Cancer begins with Capricorn. Virgo begins with Pisces, and so on. And you know what the 7th house represents, right? The partner. So what does that say about the male and female nature towards mutual relationships or towards human sexuality? The male begins with itself. The female begins with its partner. But before you finish thinking about that, there's a little bit more to this pattern that's even more interesting. The male signs end with their 7th, and the female signs end with themselves. So what we're seeing here is the male attitude towards sexual relationships starts with its own focus, focused on itself, and then evolves towards learning how to focus on the partner. Whereas the female attitude starts with the focus on the partner and evolves towards learning how to take care of itself. So think about that deeply, and I'm sure everybody would like to discuss that. So let's use the comments for that. Now let's talk about how to create your Saptamsha chart. We'll use my birth chart, but the way that we do it on my chart would be exactly the same way you would do it on your chart, except your positions of the planets would be at different degrees, obviously. So all you need to do is map out these 7 equal sections onto the zodiac and get the wheel that has the Saptamsha with the zodiac like this, and then just put your planetary placements into it. Then check and see what Saptamsha your ascendant falls in. In this case, the Saptamsha of the ascendant is Sagittarius. So get out a chart and draw Sagittarius in the first house of that chart. Then you can establish all of the rest of the houses by simply going in order around the chart from Sagittarius. Now that you have a chart with houses and signs, all you have to do is put the planets in the right signs. So if you just go counterclockwise from the ascendant, Rahu is in Virgo in this case. So we'll draw it there in Virgo, which is the 10th house of the Saptamsha. Now sometimes these amshas, like Saptamshas, Navamshas, are called Vargas. Varga means to consolidate or organize something. The reason why these are called consolidations is because they're consolidations of the parts. So if you look through the wheel and see if you have any other planets in a Virgo Saptamsha, then they'll get consolidated all into the same Virgo, even though they might be in different locations in the zodiac. In the Saptamsha, they're all in Virgo, so they consolidate. So in this case, we find that Mars and the Sun are also in a Virgo Saptamsha, even though they're in a totally different sign. They're in Leo, and Rahu is in Pisces. They're both in Virgo Saptamsha, so they both wind up in Virgo in this creativity chart in the 10th house. Then if we keep going counterclockwise, we'll find Saturn in Pisces, so draw it there in the 4th house and check and see if any other planets are in Pisces. In this case, Ketu is. So draw Ketu in the 4th house with Saturn. Keep going, you find the moon in Cancer. Is it in a Varga with anybody else? Is anybody else in the Cancer Saptamsha in this chart? Yes, Venus is. So draw Venus and the moon in Cancer 8th house of this Saptamsha. Keep going counterclockwise. We already did Mars and the Sun. We haven't done Mercury yet. Mercury is in Capricorn Saptamsha, so put it in Capricorn in the Saptamsha chart, which happens to be the 2nd house. We did Ketu, we did Venus. Last planet to do then is Jupiter, which is in Aries. So we'll draw it in Aries in this chart, which happens to be the 5th house of this chart. And this is how your chart contains hidden charts within it that are focused on particular angles and particular degrees and geometries that have to do with particular themes. By creating a chart of those angles and degrees, you can interpret that subtopic very directly and very clearly. Now that we have this chart, let's talk about how we should interpret it. Here is the simplest, easiest, and in many, many ways, most immediately useful way to interpret your subchart. Figure out the overall dignity of that subchart. Figuring that out is fairly easy because all you would have to do is average up the dignities of the planets in that chart. In my report, I average it up with a little bit more specificity. I average actually the planet's house modified dignities. So for example, a malefic in the 11th house has an easier time being dignified than a malefic in the 4th house. So taking that into consideration, I get per house dignities, and then I average that up to get your overall dignity for that subdivision. Once you have the overall dignity of the subdivision, you can make a very general but useful statement about how you do with the topics of that subdivision. So in this case, with the Saptamsha, we're talking about creativity and fertility, right? So how are you doing with your creativity? How are you doing with your fertility? You'll get an immediate overview of that by assessing the overall dignity of this subchart. The more negative the overall dignity, the more effort you have to put into this theme, the more effort you have to put into creativity, and also the more flaws there are in your creative output. Conversely, the more positive your overall dignity, the more effortless it becomes and the more flawless it becomes. So we're talking about like artistic talent. Like, how much effort does it take for you to create something artistic that doesn't have some serious flaw that makes it kind of unexciting? How much effort does it take for you to design and build something? How much effort does it take for you to bring something into reality, bring an idea into reality without messing it up? That's what we're talking about here. You can also get a quick overview of children. How fertile are you? How are your kids? Do they generally have problems, or do they generally have an easygoing time? Stuff like that. You get a very quick, clear sense or a pulse of what's going on with the creativity thing. The second very useful overall technique I want to show you today in this video is to sort your subdivision by the dominance of the planets in that subdivision. Here's an example of the table that I give in my report for each subdivision and how it's sorted by dominance. Basically, the planets that are towards the top are more dominant, the ones that are towards the bottom are less dominant, and then I also have bars underneath each one showing you the exact value of how dominant that planet is compared to the next one in the list. The way you calculate this is somewhat complex, but the way I do it in my report is, first of all, the basic measurement is how aligned is any particular planet in this subdivision with the degree of the ascendant, primarily, secondarily the moon's degree, tertiarily the sun's degree. That gives you the basic idea of how dominant each planet is. On top of that, I also take into account the dominance of the houses occupied and owned by the planets. And on top of that, even, I also take into account how many other planets a planet is dispository. How many other planets is this one the lord of? And with that, I get a full sense of dominance of a planet in a subdivision, and that allows me to create this list for you in the report. Now, right underneath this list, I provide this interpretation or an interpretive tool. It's like a verbalized version of the dominance list. And it's not meant to be the end of the interpretation, but it's meant to be the tool that you work with to really understand the interpretation. So since we're talking about the Saptamsha here, the title of the list is your creativity, because this is about how you are creative. Since the most dominant planet in this chart is Mercury, it begins with Mercury. Mercury is the most dominant planet in my approach to and experience of creativity, because we're talking about my chart here. So I give a suggested keyword here for Mercury, which is interactivity. Hopefully you know a little bit about Mercury too. You can also know a bit of the subtext of Mercury, what interactivity actually relates to intelligence, verbalization, communication, and so forth. If you're a person that has Mercury on the top of your list in your creative subdivision, then that is your most obvious asset in creativity. Your ability to communicate, your ability to interact, your ability to intelligize. Now, then you have a sequence, right? Underneath Mercury is Saturn. So what's going on interpretively is Saturn is generating or supporting Mercury. So here in the list, I'm suggesting scrutiny as a keyword for Saturn. And it's, the other things associated with scrutiny you should be aware of when you're using this list. Scrutiny has to do with pessimism or criticalness, stuff like that. So what that means is my basic attitude towards creating is mercurial. So I like to deal with words or ideas, or interactions, communications. But the subtext driving that, what I'm trying to communicate, is something critical, something Saturnian, meaning I'm trying to correct a problem, or I'm trying to solve a problem, or I'm trying to show how something was wrong, how something could be better. Or maybe I'm trying to revive something old, Saturnian, or maybe I'm trying to prevent something from dying, Saturnian. And like that, you go through this list to go to more and more subliminal aspects of your creativity. The planets which are at the top of the list are the obvious traits of your creativity. And the more you go down towards the bottom, it's things that people wouldn't really know and you might not even be aware of, but they're the subliminal driving forces. like at the bottom of my list here in creativity, is Ketu. So the subliminal force driving the creativity is actually like withdrawal, loneliness, wishing to be alone, wishing to have my own space, introspection, otherworldliness, spirituality, things of that nature that are ascribed to Ketu. Now, I want to show you a very important and useful thing that's on this list that you might overlook if you go through it too fast. You notice there's a triangle upside down on Saturn and a right side up triangle on Jupiter, and then there's a couple of flags on some of these things. Let's talk about that. If you have an upside down triangle next to a planet in one of your lists, it means this is too much. You should try to make it less. And conversely, if you have a right side up triangle, it means that this planet is not enough. You could make it more. You should use it more. So, right, in my case, I have an upside down triangle on Saturn. Now, the reason why Saturn has an upside down triangle is simply because it's high up on the list, yet it has a low dignity. That means it's something that's pretty obvious and dominant in my creativity, but doesn't really function very effectively. So it means pessimism, negativity, etc. is hampering the flawlessness and the ease of my creative output. I could turn that down a bit, or I could tone it down a bit, make it more subliminal, not make it as obvious. Then I would have better success. And the reason why Jupiter has a right side up triangle is because it's low on the list, but has a really good dignity. So it's very effective because it has a good dignity. The dignity indicates its effectiveness, but its lack of dominance indicates that it's not being utilized very much. So again, you have to use your brain a little bit for this. Like in any communication, it's on both parties. So with an astrological reading or report, it's not just the astrologer, it's also the recipient. You have to both engage and intelligize the content. So if you notice, there's Jupiter and Saturn with the triangles. So it should ring a bell that these two planets are opposites, and therefore the polarity between these two planets is really what's being highlighted here. It's the polarity between positivity and negativity, or optimism and pessimism, or encouragement versus discouragement. So the encouragement part in my creative process should rise up. If I can bring it up higher, I will be more effective. And the kind of corrective, stern part could go down, and that would also increase the effectiveness. That's what these triangles are telling us. Your triangles, of course, will be different, but this is the way that you go about reading what these triangles are trying to tell you in your report. The other really useful little markup on this list are the flags. You'll notice there's actually quite a few flags on this list, unfortunately. Flags indicate where there's what I call a jarring transition between two approaches. And it actually simply happens where you have a benefic followed by a malefic, or vice versa. Because benefics and malefics have generally categorically different feels to them. One feels soft and the other feels hard. So when a dominance list has a soft thing followed by a hard thing, or a hard thing followed by a soft thing, it becomes disconcerting to those who are experiencing it, and also to you as the native. So to clarify that, let's look at the first flag. Saturn has been flagged also for being a jarring transition out of Mercury. So what that means is that Mercury is fairly friendly, isn't it? So the first impression that people get in creative interaction with this person is friendliness, or some kind of like non-biased intelligentness. But then all of a sudden, after they engage for a while, there comes along the Saturn that's underneath it, supporting it, driving it, which is critical and harsh, and also like doesn't feel so fair. It feels more decisive. And it's not that Saturn is wrong and Mercury is right, or Mercury is wrong and Saturn is right. It's the transition between the two that makes people feel like, wait, I think I misread this guy, or I think this guy isn't what he seemed like. It confuses people. It makes them doubt what is going on, so it hampers the process. This list has quite a few flags. There's Venus coming right after the sun. So there's all this confidence or self-confidence from the sun, but that's being driven by love and generosity of Venus. But it causes people to misunderstand the self-confidence because of the jarring transition to the Venus. And you can go through this whole list and figure out all these things about yourself. I mean, this is my list, so you can figure out these things about me. But I'm just showing you this so that when you get your report and you have your list, you have an example already of how to interpret and how to work with this information. This is very, 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 very useful information that you can use to change your life for the better. What you would do with the flag things is to be aware of the fact that you're going to confuse people when you switch gears from this to this. Now, the only remaining question is, how do you get this report so that you can get this information for yourself? That's fairly easy. You go to my website, victicare.com, and you click on the readings link, and then you select what module you want. If you want the basic chart interpreted, get the basic module, and if you want all of your subdivisions, including the Saptamsha, interpreted, then you click to include also the subdivisions module, and then you click this to enter your birth data, and then you click this button to order it. Please don't forget to like and comment, and your likes and your comments help YouTube recognize that this video is something that should be shown to new people. So please help out with that. Thank you so much.